Shavkat Rakhmonov kept his undefeated streak alive as he took out Ian Gary at UFC 310, but a lot of fans, and if you're reading online, think that he is not as good as advertised because of his performance in that fight. And I'm going to talk about why I think a lot of fans are wrong about this in today's video. My name is James Lynch. So first and foremost, what I'm seeing online is that Shavkat's overrated, that he's not as good as we all thought. I've heard some people say that, you know, he didn't deserve to get the win. And I thought the fight was very close, but I think he won the fight. I don't think there was much of a controversy there. It was certainly closer than it needed to be. But I think a lot of people are not really analyzing the context of Shavkat taking this fight and having this fight against Gary. If you remember, originally he was supposed to fight Bilal Muhammad, and he ends up fighting Ian Gary. I think the first point that people are really missing in this scenario is that Ian Gary is just that good. I think there's a mix of people not liking Ian Gary for a variety of reasons outside the cage. And you also look at some of his past performances, like against MVP or Jeff Neal, that weren't exactly the most exciting fights in the world. But I think in this fight, he leveled up. I think he showed that he's got really good takedown defense. He can take a punch. I mean, Shavkat did hit him a few times. I think that's one thing that people are totally forgetting in this fight is that Gary is as advertised. He's 27. He looked very good in this fight. And like I said, made it a lot closer than people thought. So I think that's sort of the first point is that people aren't giving Ian Gary enough credit. And again, you can have your own opinion on Ian Gary outside the cage, but Ian Gary, the fighter, put on a very good performance on Saturday. And I think that his stock absolutely went up after that performance and showed that he is a contender in this weight class. One of the things that people aren't talking enough about is the fact that, like I just mentioned, how good Ian Gary was, is that going from Stephen Wonderboy Thompson to Ian Gary is a big step up if you think about it, right? And yes, he fought Jeff Neal before that. Jeff Neal missed weight in that fight. Like, if you look at some of the names that he's fought, they're all ranked opponents: Neil Magny, Jeff Neal, Stephen Thompson. Stephen Thompson is getting up there in age. He's 41. I don't know how much longer he's going to be competing in the UFC. And yes, he looked great in that fight and got the finish. But this is also someone that's not in his prime right now, and it's, you know, someone that, like I said, is not going to be, you know, on the road to the title anytime soon. So I think people got to look at that. You know, going from Thompson to Gary was a bit of a step up. I also think that Shavkat is kind of a victim of his own success. I think everyone had this expectation that Shavkat was going to go in and finish Ian Gary quickly, and I think when you have fights like he's had against competition that, you know, is not really contenders, like none of these guys are contenders, Magny, Neal, or Thompson. At this point, when you're going in there and finishing these opponents, there's this expectation that you're going to do it every single fight. So that doesn't end up happening. Instead, we get a fight in the first couple rounds, maybe that isn't so appealing, a lot of grappling, a lot of pushing against the cage. And so fans are upset by that. But what they're not realizing is that Gary is just that good of an opponent when it comes to stuffing those takedowns and everything else. So kind of what I'm getting at here is that I think Shavkat, the bar was set so high for him that anything other than a finish, fans are going to be upset with. Like, even if this fight was more entertaining, let's say the fight was entertaining the entire fight, I think fans would still complain if he didn't finish Ian Gary for those reasons I mentioned, that people don't like Gary and the fact that Shavkat has never gone the distance in 19 career fights, which is crazy. And this reminds me a bit of Israel Adesanya as well. Israel Adesanya finished most of his opponents on his run up to winning the UFC middleweight title, including his title win over Robert Whittaker. But he had a lot of fights after that went the distance. And I think part of that is the type of fighters he's competing against. The more you move up, the harder the fights are. You're not going to get finishes all the time. So I think Shavkat was kind of in a similar situation fighting Ian Gary here. The other thing that people aren't talking nearly enough about, Shavkat had the longest layoff in his UFC career going into this fight. It was 357 days. If you look at the Stephen Thompson fight, that took place in December of 2023, December 16th. He fights on December 7th, 2024. That's a long time to be waiting. And part of that was because of the fact that it looked like him and Jack Della Maddalena were going to fight. Jack was still not recovering from his injury, so they just decided to give Shavkat the title shot, and obviously Bilal's out, and they replaced him with Ian Gary. So that's another thing I think people aren't really looking at enough. If you have a long layoff like that, it can affect certain fighters, and I think it did in this fight. But the most important thing is something that we found out this morning. Daniel Cormier, we're going to read the quote here from Home of Fight. Shout out to Home of Fight. I'm with them now. He says, Shavkat Rakhmonov reportedly had a torn MCL going into his fight with Ian Gary, according to Daniel Cormier. I learned after that Shavkat fought with an injury. I think he tore his MCL going into this fight, fought with the torn ligament. You are not going to look like a killer that you look like in the fights prior. So add this in. Let's say, and again, this is not 100% confirmed, but let's say he did have a torn MCL. Does it make a bit more sense why he was not going in there and finishing Ian Gary or looking that great? Like, again, I think fans have such unrealistic expectations when it comes to certain fighters that if they're not going in there and finishing, that somehow they're not good enough. I heard this with Corey Sandhagen when he fought Rob Font. Corey Sandhagen hurts his hand in the fight. He ends up taking Rob to a decision, and all of a sudden, Corey Sandhagen's overrated. But no, injuries happen, people. And this is why you're not seeing maybe the performance you thought. Shavkat could have been healthy and had a similar performance against Ian Gary, and it could just be because Ian Gary is that good. I think fans aren't looking at that enough. So that's kind of where... I'm just seeing a lot of talk, like people calling him overrated. I see people bringing up Khamzat Chimaev and be like, oh, Chimaev would have destroyed Shavkat. I mean, Chimaev's in a different weight class, but let's also remember that, again, you're bound to have an off night. It's going to happen. Jack Della Maddalena fights Basil Hafez, right? And everyone talked about, oh, Jack's not as good as we thought. Basil Hafez should have won that fight. And then what does Jack do after that fight? He finishes Gilbert Burns. So it's like sometimes fighters are allowed to have an off night. Fans have this unrealistic idea that every fighter is like, Islam. And even Islam himself lost a couple years ago. But you get where I'm going with this. It's like fans have this idea that fighters just remain undefeated. Even Alex Pereira has been knocked out. You know what I mean? In the UFC, Adesanya knocked him out. Fighters are going to lose, or they're going to have nights where they don't look as good as they are. And listen, no fighter is 100% going into a fight, but if you have a torn MCL, that's of course going to compromise you going in there. So kind of what the point of this video was is that I just think that fans are too quick to react to things. I personally didn't think the fight was that bad. Could it have been more entertaining in those earlier rounds? For sure. But there was a lot of drama. And I think people also got to give credit to Shavkat for being in that really bad position. Gary's getting the choke in, and Shavkat was able to get out of that. How many welterweights do you think are getting out of that choke late in a fight like that? And I think another thing we got to bring up is that Shavkat has obviously got some cardio. I mean, that choke was late in the fight. Shavkat's able to get out, muster the energy to get out. I mean, that's pretty hard to do. That's very high level, but fans don't focus on that. They focus on, oh, the rounds before were boring. This guy's overrated. He's going to get destroyed by Bilal Muhammad. It's like, no. I think personally, if him and Bilal fight, I think it's a very even fight. I think if Shavkat and Bilal are both 100% healthy, they get full camps. I think that's a really interesting matchup. Bilal looked phenomenal in his last fight against Leon Edwards, but every fight is different. Shavkat goes out there and finishes Jeff Neal. Ian Gary takes Jeff Neal to a decision. Who's the better fighter based off that? You'd think Shavkat, but then Shavkat has a closer fight with Ian Gary. So this is what I mean. We got to stop focusing on one fight and it's the end of the world. I see this far too often, especially with newer fans, where they come in here and they want to judge one fight and they think a fighter's terrible now. That's all I'm hearing right now. Shavkat's overrated. He was never that good. I mean, again, let's go over the optics going into this fight. Jeff Neal Neil Magny's been finished a few times, but still he finishes Neil Magny. Ian Gary couldn't finish Neil Magny. Jeff Neal's never been finished in the UFC until this fight. I think he was finished on the regional, or he was finished against Kevin Holland on the regional scene. But outside of that, Jeff Neal, very hard to take out. And then you've got Stephen Thompson. Prior to that stoppage loss, prior to him finishing Stephen Thompson, the only other time Stephen Thompson was stopped in the UFC was a Superman punch from Anthony Pettis in a fight that Pettis was losing. So again, that's a good win. But that's the problem, is that with Shavkat's performances, he sets the bar so high, fans are expecting something, and sometimes things aren't going to happen. Do you guys remember Francis Ngannou and Derek Lewis? That fight was awful. Nobody thought that fight was going to end up like that. It happens. Sometimes fighters are tentative, sometimes things happen, sometimes there's injuries. Fans got to take a little bit more of a look at that instead of judging and being so reactionary. I think Bilal and Shavkat's going to be a phenomenal fight. I will be breaking that one down once it's official, an early look. But again, I think that fight is very interesting, and I think fans got to quit fixating so much on specific fights. Nothing wrong with criticizing the performance. I don't have a problem with that. The problem I have is people saying that Shavkat's overrated, that, oh, how can you possibly pick him against Bilal? People are just overreacting to one fight. And I'm telling you, people can have an off night. It's going to happen. So I want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you agree with me here, or are you still in the narrative that Shavkat is overrated and this is a sign of things to come? Let me know in the comments. Follow me on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, @Lynch on Sports. My name is James Lynch. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.